Even if it's a lone wolf, as first suggested by President Trump, Saturday night's White House Correspondents Dinner drama certainly did not happen in a vacuum. And just as mass shootings have become commonplace in a United States overrun by firearms, so have attempts on the lives of political figures, both on the left and the right. We'll ask about the latest targeting of the U.S. president and the echo chambers that amplify vilification and hate that turn adversaries into enemies. A social media landscape where conspiracy theories can make a better fit than facts, both as ideology and as a business model. In the build-up to said White House Correspondents' Dinner, all the talk was of how traditional media, already on the back foot, would respond to all the bashing they were going to get from Trump, particularly in the week that saw a mega merger that could change the course of globally renowned news outlet CNN. We'll never know. The speech never happened. Partisanship has always existed, but as the United States gets set to mark its 250th anniversary, is this time different? Is the level of verbal violence specific to a nation where gerrymandered constituencies encourage radical rhetoric? Or do more and more globally people think that they're above the law? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about the culture of hate in Trump's America. He's decamped from that White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington for the safety of New York City. Nico Hines, Global Editorial Director at the Daily Beast. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. How are you?
I'm okay. Good to see Madeline Schwartz, Editor-in-Chief of The Dial magazine, whose upcoming book, How We See It, The World Looks at America in the Age of Trump, is available for pre-order. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Bruce Kane, professor of political science at Stanford University, has jumped 9 time zones over to the French capital. How are you?
Happy to be here.
Okay, good to see you. And from Nashville, Tennessee, Jacob Machangma, founder and executive director of Vanderbilt University's The Future of Free Speech think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
On the go, you can listen to it wherever podcasts are streamed. That's a reminder. Yeah, the cameras were indeed rolling. Footage from the Washington Hilton Hotel Saturday night. We can show some of it courtesy of the video journalists at the French news agency AFP, who are on the invite list, which is handy when a major news event happens. Nico Hines, tell us how your Saturday night went.
Yeah, it was not exactly as I had expected. I was thinking that we were in for a night of long, potentially sometimes boring speeches. The event was rather more exciting than anybody wanted it to be. Certainly pulses were quickened when we heard 5 gunshots, which came very close to our table, or at least the door that the gunman was approaching was very close to our table. So everybody took cover and stared around and tried to figure out what was happening. Nobody at any point told us that it was all clear. We'd seen the president and some of the senior members of the cabinet whisked out of the room, but no police or anybody announced that the gunman had been apprehended or that the situation was now safe. So people kind of gradually returned to chitter-chatter, and it was a very, very surreal evening.
Yeah, there was the burrata salad, the one that talent agent Michael Glantz calmly continued eating while the pandemonium erupted. The native New Yorker who spoke to the New York Times, he was one of the guests at this event. There you see him at the bottom of your screen, continuing to eat while the people make sense of what's going on. He said, first of all, I have a bad back. I couldn't get on the floor. And if I did get on the floor, they'd have to bring in people to get me off the floor. And number 2, I'm a hygiene freak. There was no freaking way I was getting in my new tux on the dirty Hilton floor. He said that to the New York Times. Nico, did you finish your burrata salad?
Do you know, I'd forgotten all about it, and then I went to sit down about an hour of panic and chaos after the shots had been fired, and I slumped back into my chair, and I looked at my plate, and there was a fork was loaded up with the last bite of burrata salad, which I then treated myself to at about 9:30 on Saturday evening. Sadly, we didn't get to see the steak and lobster course, which was due to come out next. Events rather overtook that one.
Yeah, let me ask you, because France 24's correspondent Fraser Jackson was also with you at that dinner. He said there seemed to be less security than at other times. I know the executive editor of the Daily Beast was in the hotel room adjacent to the one of the suspect.
That's right. The alleged gunman was staying on our floor, which was the 10th floor of the Washington Hilton, a hotel, obviously, which is famous for the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. And, many decades later, there has still not been a significant upgrade in the security at the hotel. In fact, John Hinckley Jr. himself was quoted today criticizing the security at the Hilton. And this was the man who should know. He was the man who fired the shots at Reagan. What is notable when you're there for the event is that this is a working hotel. This is not a White House event. This is an event put on by journalists. And as we know, journalists don't have a very big budget. So they certainly don't have the budget to close down this enormous hotel in central Washington, D.C. So if you're staying in the hotel, you can come and go as normal. There are a few extra layers of security, but if you look at the gunman's manifesto, he wrote that he thought the lack of security was insane at the hotel, and he was quite impressed with himself that he had arrived a day early, and said that because he'd come a day early, that nobody had checked his luggage. Well, I arrived about half an hour before it started with my big suitcase, several other bags all stacked up, dragging up the street. And I can tell you that even half an hour before the event began, when there were thousands of people already gathered, nobody looked at my bag. Nobody asked me any questions about why I was carrying so much. And when I was going down to the event, after a quick change and shower, I hopped into the wrong lift. And accidentally didn't arrive back in the lobby where I was expecting to be, but came out behind the scenes. And I only realized after wandering around trying to find the entrance to the ballroom that I'd actually bypassed 2 layers of security. It seems that the alleged gunman did the exact same thing. He used an internal set of stairs and popped out in the same sort of place that I did about an hour after I had done.
Madeline Schwartz, how will history remember this Saturday night?
Well, it's not just a single event. We're living in a time of growing political violence, and poll after poll have shown that Americans that political violence is no longer the taboo that it once was. Although most Americans have no propensity to political violence, up to 30%, according to one recent poll, can agree with statements saying that political violence might be useful to get the country back on track in their
30%.
Views. Yes.
Wow. And so what were people saying? Because we've seen, for instance, the First Lady's taking shots at a late-night television host for making what she deems to be tasteless jokes. She wants him removed from his post as a result, saying this kind of egged it on. We heard earlier the White House spokesperson denouncing left-wing radical rhetoric.
Well, it's what people are saying. It's also what people are not saying. The scholar Liliana Mason, who studies political violence at Johns Hopkins University, has done a study in which she showed that when presented with statements condemning political violence from both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, respondents always have a lesser propensity or dislike of political violence. And yet, when we look at our leaders today, many of them are not condemning political violence or doing so in ways that continue to cast blame.
Yeah, and there was also the way when people are getting their news in real time, the way in which this story, I guess, was told. While the White House was getting its story straight, the Justice Department was just beginning its inquiry after all the shooting had just happened. Social media quick to fill the vacuum with the word staged exploding online following the attack. Both right and left-wing influencers, as well as anonymous accounts, spreading unfounded conspiracy theories. Sitting in Nashville, Tennessee, in the center of the United States, Jacob Mashangama, these conspiracy theories, how rife, how common have they been since Saturday night?
I don't have exact statistics, but it's certainly something that you are confronted with when you go online. So I would say it's prevalent. How much of an effect it has, I'm not sure, but obviously concerning that there are people who seem to believe without any evidence that this is staged.
So there's the conspiracy theories that come out, and then what happens? Is there going to be the noise that sort of settles once we get the facts?
I think that there's definitely an ecosystem out there that is very receptive to conspiracy theories. I would imagine that once facts come out, there's hopefully a critical mass of people who will believe the facts as they unfold. But I do think that there will be people on both sides who are very committed to conspiracy theories that sort of support their ideological outlook on the world.
Bruce Kane, you heard at the outset.
And that is, of course.
Go ahead, Jacob. No, I was going to say, Bruce Kane, you heard at the outset.
I said that's obviously one of the concerning things about.
No, it seems to be a delay. Apologies for that when you're speaking. We'll get back to Jacob in a moment. Bruce Kane, you heard at the outset Nico Hines referencing the last time there was an attempt on a president's life at the Washington Hilton. It was 1981. I remember it well. Mm-hmm. The way that the story unfolds today versus then. Tell us about the contrast there.
I think when it happened back when Ronald Reagan was president, it was not a total shock because we had had the death of JFK. We had had a history of assassinations. But in the modern era, I think there was a moment of confusion at the time.
Absolutely. It was the Secretary of State saying, I'm in charge, because he was the only one inside the White House.
It had a lot to do with the personality of the Secretary of State, but okay. But I think, the reality is that we thought we were doing a better job of protecting the president since the JFK. And so it was a wake-up call that it's very hard to protect presidents in public places. And this president is, he golfs in large, places that with trees that people can shoot from.
Which is what happened in one of those three assassination attempts.
Exactly. And, he likes these outdoor sessions rally sessions that are quite, if you like, inciting. So he's not an easy president to protect, that's for sure.
And from here, you wake up and all the talk is about guns. And it doesn't seem to be that big of a conversation topic in the United States. People are like, well, you give guns to everybody, what do you expect?
Well, this is, in my lifetime, and that's a very long lifetime, I would say, this is one of the most frustrating conversations that never goes anywhere, is the conversation about guns. There actually were periods about 40 years ago where we were able to get a ban on automatic weapons. So we did look like we were making some progress on this.
And particularly after the assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, no, we had lots of reasons to do it. The problem that you have is that there's a constitutional provision that gives the right to defense, self-defense and arms, which has been interpreted very liberally by the courts. And so even when there are jurisdictions now that try to take stricter gun measures, we can run into trouble with the federal courts, as D.C. did recently. So it's a very frustrating problem because I agree with Europeans. The fact that we have so many guns on the street is absolutely toxic and problematic.
All right, we're going to know more in the days to come about this manifesto that was reportedly left by the suspect on Fox News. The U.S. president talked about a motive. He called a religious thing, pointing to anti-Christian rhetoric in that note. On broadcaster CBS's flagship investigative news show 60 Minutes, Journalist Nora O'Donnell asked the U.S. president about it.
He appears to reference a motive in it. He writes this, quote, administration officials, they are targets. And he also wrote this, I am no longer willing to permit a pedophile, rapist, and traitor to coat my hands with his crimes. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I was waiting for you to read that because I knew you would, because you're horrible people, horrible people. Yeah, he did write that. I'm not a rapist. I didn't rape anybody.
Do you think he was referring to you?
Excuse me. I'm not a pedophile. You read that crap from some sick person. I got associated with all stuff that has nothing to do with me. I was totally exonerated. Your friends on the other side of the plate are the ones that were involved with, let's say, Epstein or other things. But I said to myself, you know, I'll do this interview and they'll probably, I read the manifesto, you know, he's a sick person, but you should be ashamed of yourself reading that because I'm not any of those things.
Mr. President,
and
these
I was
are
never,
the gunman's words.
Excuse me. You shouldn't be reading that on 60 Minutes. You're a disgrace. But go ahead, let's finish the interview.
The other thing that he wrote in
You're disgraceful.
Madeline Schwartz, this was the interview broadcast on Sunday night. What's your reaction when you hear that?
Well, and in some ways, I'm glad that you played this clip because one element of political violence that I don't think we often talk about is violence against journalists. And 2025 was, by some measures, the most violent year against journalists worldwide. And here we see the President of the United States calling a journalist a disgrace for asking a question that is a question that is in the interest of the American people to know his opinion of this kind of language is very strong.
So we get to the question, the core question here. How did it get to this in the United States? Where, you have this legacy media, CBS News, its flagship program, 60 Minutes, airs on Sunday night, and the President of the United States bashes the journalists asking the questions.
Well, unfortunately, we live in an information environment where no matter who the speaker is, their words carry faster and louder if they are in some ways promoting division than if they're not. And that is a very, very noisy world that has unfortunately become our information ecosystem.
Is it inevitable? It's just because it's the speed of information and therefore that's the way it will always be henceforth?
It absolutely isn't inevitable, and I think that that there are many people trying to think of ways to make it a lot less inevitable. For me, as a journalist, one thing I think about a lot is dissemination of facts, as opposed to dissemination of dangerous speech. And the reality is, we live in a world where it's actually never been easier to find the facts on something, but these facts have to compete with, as you talked about earlier, social media posts, rumors, conspiracy theories, and that is overwhelming and confusing for a lot of people.
What reaction, Nico Hines, has there been to that 60 Minutes interview?
Well, look, I think what was very obvious from Donald Trump's reaction is that he was triggered by what was being asked, and therefore perhaps it suggests some insight into his psyche, into what he's worried about. But I do actually think that he has a pretty good point there. I don't think we would have asked Barack Obama live on television if he'd been shot at by, or if there had been an attempted assassination by perhaps a extreme right-wing racist or a jihadi who had made unfounded claims. I don't think the president would have been put in a TV studio 24 hours later and asked, is it true that he's part of an inferior race? Or is it true that as a Christian, he deserves to die because he's destroying the Islamic world? That would not have happened. So I do think we have to try and step back a little bit and stay calm as journalists, because we sometimes invite some of the conflicts and the confrontations ourselves.
In the last minutes, the U.S. president seconding what the First Lady said, asking for the sacking of this popular late-night television host, Jimmy Kimmel, over a joke he made before Saturday's gala about Mrs. Trump. Again, is it all just a bit of infotainment, or is this something more serious?
It's entirely ahistorical to suggest that this is some new era of political violence in the United States. This is a country that was forged in violence. You know, take it all the way back to the American War of Independence in the very first place, right? There was a civil war. Abraham Lincoln was murdered in 1865, and by 1901, two other presidents had been assassinated. In the 1960s, you had JFK killed, then RFK killed, then MLK killed. You know, it's kind of nonsensical for people to be talking about this as though it's a kind of a new problem. However, there is certainly a kind of ludicrous modern twist on it when, you know, the White House and Melania Trump, who, let's remember, very rarely says anything in public at all, are trying to attack their kind of favorite enemy in Jimmy Kimmel. This is somebody that Trump has been trying to get fired for at least 18 months now directly. He's been attacking him for years. If you look back over Trump's old tweets, you know, you'll see him attacking Jimmy Kimmel probably a decade ago. So it does seem somewhat ludicrous to try and tie a late night comedian to the act of violence last night. However, this is nothing new in the United States. This is what happens over here.
You agree, Jacob Mchangama, this is nothing new?
Yeah, I certainly agree. 1968, obviously a momentous year in American history, and as was laid out before, political violence, unfortunately, is not nothing. It's nothing new in this country. I'm sorry if you can also hear the echo in the background. I don't know if there's a technical.
Not at all.
problem.
It's good.
Okay. I think what concerns me more is I'm not so concerned about Donald Trump, you know, immediately after an assassination attempt criticizing a journalist. I'm more concerned about his threats against journalists and free speech generally. And this is where I think you see a disconnect between those who are calling for stricter regulation of speech in the US, saying that the First Amendment has become weaponized against truth, against democracy. But if there were European-style laws in the US, arguably Donald Trump would be able to go after some of the people who criticize him the most. You see Caroline Levitt describing some of the rhetoric as hate speech. Well, hate speech is criminalized in most other democracies apart from the US. And so this is the conundrum at heart here, where my view is that we're at a inflection point maybe in American history, but it would be a cure worse than the disease if we try to say, well, what we need to do is to restrict free speech even more. That would essentially limit the ability of the press to hold governments, Trump and others, accountable, and very likely lead to a crackdown on criticism online, which is also important for ordinary citizens to be able to express criticism of governments. But that does not mean that we should be indifferent to the polarization, to the conspiracies that float around. But fortunately, there are ways that we can empower people. A very interesting example was after the Alex Freddie shooting in Minnesota, where you saw the White House immediately claim that this was a domestic terrorist, but where leading members of the Trump administration were community noted on X, a platform which is pretty friendly to MAGA. So that is one way where we can actually use technology to try and push back on corrosive lies and disinformation.
So, okay, there's a couple of points to unpack in what you've just said there, Jacob. First of all, this question of freedom of speech. We heard Bruce Kane earlier talking about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. You're talking about the First Amendment, the right of free speech in the U.S. Constitution. We saw the State Department last year go after those who are fact checkers in places like Germany, saying freedom of expression is under threat in Germany and other countries. It's according to the 2024 Human Rights Report by the U.S. State Department. It's an official document. German disinformation researchers, among 5 Europeans that were slapped with visa bans by the U.S. They also include, and here you see him, the former Digital Services Commissioner for the European Commission, Frenchman Thierry Breton. So that First Amendment that you talked about, Jacob, it prevents Donald Trump from, you're saying, from going after political enemies legally over what they say, but they're doing it abroad?
Yeah, this is the tragedy of the transatlantic fallout over free speech. It is absolutely true that countries like France, like Germany, have restricted increasingly free speech, with going far beyond what I would be comfortable with in a democracy. But it is obviously also hypocritical on the part of the Trump administration to say, we think there's a problem with free speech in Germany, and therefore we're going to restrict the rights of those who exercise their free speech in a way that we disagree with. And there are lots of examples. The Trump administration has gone after Wall Street Journal, New York Times, pollsters, law firms, and so on. One of the things that we've seen, though, in a lot of cases, is that courts have actually prevented the Trump administration from legally punishing media outlets, from punishing law firms, and so on. So that is the value of the First Amendment, which unfortunately the Trump administration praises in rhetoric, but does not live up to in practice, and in many ways systematically has targeted in ways that no recent other administration has done.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the burrata salad that we talked about earlier. Newspapers like USA Today digging up pictures of that talent agent who finished his first course during the gala on Saturday night, including one we can show you from the 2024 White House Correspondents Dinner. He's posing alongside one of CNN's veteran reporters, Wolf Blitzer. CNN, where the future since last week's a little bit uncertain after the provisional approval for Paramount's buyout of parent company Warner Discovery. So, Bruce Kane, no First Amendment issues here. It's just a simple business transaction. Although there were political favors curried by some of the billionaires involved in this deal.
Yeah, you always worry about that this is, while it calls itself a populist administration, in reality, it's very much dominated by billionaires who are making money through various deals, side deals with the administration. So, the concentration of media and the disappearance of media is a big concern in the United States. That a lot of local newspapers have gone under, a lot of state newspapers have gone under. I will tell you the students are not reading newspapers. They're catching articles on the news aggregators, but they're not subscribing to any of the quality newspapers. So,
and why is that?
Well, I think as much as anything, it's because of the iPhones. It's because of the social media. It's about you can get information in a much easier way than reading it and share it with people and express views on it. So it's more participatory and more fun for them. But it is puzzling. I've spent a lot of time scolding them about not getting subscriptions. And I can tell you that it doesn't work. They're going to continue to do this. So the monetary underpinnings for traditional media is shifting, and then consolidation becomes part of that process. And I think it's a very worrying concern.
So consolidation of media, we saw it recently with the Washington Post, owned by another tech billionaire, which fired all of its editorial board. But this point is an important one brought up by Bruce Kane. Jacob Mashangama's native Denmark, leading the resistance, according to a report last year by the Reuters Institute and Oxford University, in terms of proportion of people who say that their social media is their main source of news, 12%, according to that study. Although I must say, Madeline Schwartz, our team in the newsroom has questions about the data from that study. That shows that just 44% go to social media first for news. They're suspicious of those numbers. They think it's probably even higher.
Well, when preparing for this show, I went on social media to see what people were saying about all of the events that we've had, that we've seen take place in the last few days. And it was a reminder that relying on social media for news is not a good way to get news. And here I'm talking about information and not speech, which I think is an important distinction we need to make when we're talking about the environment that we're all in. I was able to see a huge range of opinions and theories about what had happened, but actually finding out what had been reported was nearly impossible just by looking on social media. And that's one of the challenges that we're in, which is that there are great reporters who are doing work, but actually a lot of their reporting is not always being seen by people who need it most.
Yeah, Jacob Mashangama, what does your research find in terms of people's attention spans getting shorter? Is that ultimately what dilutes citizens getting informed and being active and being able to interact in a common space?
I have not done specific research on that. We're a free speech oriented think tank. I will say that social media can absolutely increase your ability to navigate news and access information that you could not get in the analog age. But what it requires of citizens is that they actively curate their feeds, that they follow high quality outlets. And one of the other things is that you can get takes from experts that might contradict some of the things that are being reported or give you additional angles to what mainstream media gives you, which I think personally is a good thing. But it's also true that you can have a feed if you're not disciplined, if you don't care about quality information, if all you're looking for is information that confirms your own outlook, then you can essentially silo yourself in a low information environment, and so in that sense, it's a double-edged sword.
Nico Hines, growing up in the UK, people there, they've got their tabloids. The tabloids have blaring headlines even before digital existed. People kind of knew, though, most of the time that it's a bit of a laugh, right? You're doing it because for the puns as much as for the actual story. There's an element that it's fun to read these papers. Today, is it people taking things more literally than they used to?
No, I think as much as I've got great respect for Professor Kane, it's not going to work to scold an entire generation into doing what we think that they ought to do, or telling them that they ought to do what we did when we were their age, or probably in reality what we didn't do when we were their age, but what we did when we were a bit older. What we need to do as media is look at our position here, look at our role, and go and meet the moment. So we need to find ways that we can engage with people on different formats on social media. I mean, if you look at the Daily Beast, for example, we work very hard at finding audiences away from the traditional. So, we've been expanding our YouTube presence, and it's been fantastically successful over the last 6 months or so. We got, I think, 3 million people watched a podcast that we did about a week ago. And these are numbers that absolutely dwarf what are that are people that are watching CNN or the kind of major news channels over here on a typical evening. So I think we shouldn't give up hope. And yes, one of the things that has made the Daily Beast successful in a way that some other newspapers like the Washington Post have struggled is that we do try and be engaging, we do try and be punchy, we do try and have that tabloid edge, but whilst also reporting accurately. What we're trying to do is cover the news fairly, cover the news accurately, but also cover the news in a way that's entertaining and engages younger people. So look, I think it's all very well hand-wringing, and I'm not saying I disagree, but we also need to try and be proactive in seeking out those audiences and talking to them and not talking down to them.
All right, so trying to not talk down, trying to find a common space, but there is this broader issue at the outset. Donald Trump elected in 2024, Madeleine Schwartz, after the insurrection of January the 6th, where he refused to recognize his defeat to Joe Biden in the previous presidential election. Today, for his supporters, it's a forgotten piece of history.
I don't know that it's so forgotten. I think in many ways that event casts a very long shadow over the period that we are now in. But the reality of the period that we're in is that in some ways everyone is picking and choosing what the important moment is to cast their own version of events around. At the Dial, for our book that you mentioned at the beginning of this segment, How We See It, The World Looks at America at the Age of Trump, we have a wonderful essay by a Ukrainian journalist who's the only Ukrainian journalist to have covered every presidential election in the United States from 2008 to the most recent one. And one thing that she says is that everywhere she went, she could be in a small town, Natalia Gumanyuk, and find that people talking about their own town would see an entirely different set of problems, of issues. They would depending on the media that they read. And that's already tricky at the level of a town, but at the level of a country, that makes functioning as a society pretty difficult.
It's always been that way, though. It's what in the early 19th century, the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville marveled at when he saw the United States, how at the local level, things are different.
Oh, absolutely. I think and you could talk about Tocqueville for hours. The question is, when two neighbors looking at the same series of events see those events in completely different ways, how then will they come to an agreement about what to do? I mean, what's remarkable about all of the polling that comes out of the United States is that there's actually numerous studies that most Americans agree more on issues than they disagree, and yet they feel more polarized than ever, which of course makes discussing and finding solutions to the issues that they disagree about harder and harder and harder.
So, Bruce Kane, is this an issue of ideology, of ideological differences, or is it an issue of both parties in the United States gaming the system? A week ago, we saw a referendum in the state of Virginia where they redistricted. If you're a Democrat, you'd call it redistricting. If you're a Republican, you'd probably call it gerrymandering, which is redrawing electoral lines so that you could get 4 more members of Congress, in this case, Democrats. And this is because there's warfare going on between Republican states and Democratic states. And it's what critics call the parties choosing their voters rather than the voters choosing their parties. But this redistricting, is it just this institutional quirk that allows this that's the problem, or is it ideology?
Well, the court has considered this very seriously and decided that the Constitution doesn't have embedded in it a notion of fairness the way proportional representation systems do, like you find in Europe. And so they're unable to find a clear criteria of fairness to impose on the country. And that is why they have left it in a situation they didn't want to leave it in, which was to say, I'm afraid until we get a piece of legislation from the Congress or a constitutional amendment, we really can't do anything about it. So it does leave a situation where we are in right now, where mid-decade redistricting, which has in the past been rare and taboo, that is not just doing it right after the census, but doing it
because it's every
10 years.
Every
right.
10 years normally.
Yeah, but now what you're seeing is doing it as a result of political circumstances in the middle of a cycle, and that is novel. And once it starts the pathway downward, then the other side is going to react because they have to. Otherwise, they're going to be at a disadvantage. And
it makes the political speech more radical.
Well, ironically. And you're actually talking to somebody who's written several books on this topic. Ironically, the one advantage of drawing these partisan lines is you get more competitive seats, because in order to try to win more seats from the other side, you make some of your own seats less safe. So ironically, it'll be more fun for us to watch because there'll be more competitive
You
races.
think there'll be more seats up for grabs
as a result
November?
of this? That's right. There are seats that in Texas and in California that we never would have thought of as competitive that now will be watched, at least initially, as potentially competitive. So yes, what happened was both parties were doing something called a bipartisan gerrymander, which means they were making their seats safer so that they didn't have to worry about spending money in the general election. Now we have more competitive seats, at least in a small number of seats.
Jacob Machangama, again, sitting in Nashville. What do you make of it?
Again, this is not my expertise. What Mr. Kane said there, I don't have the expertise to challenge. I live in a very red state. I would be surprised to see if Tennessee was generally very competitive for Democrats. That would be an interesting development. How it affects the speech environment, I'm not sure about either. So I very little
Has
to,
the rhetoric
to add,
become more
Mr.
or
King.
less violent since Trump was inaugurated?
In Tennessee or
In Tennessee, where you're
general?
sitting?
That is a good question. I think that definitely the rhetoric here can be very heated. We have a supermajority in the Capitol. There have been instances where, for instance, Democratic lawmakers were expelled. So political polarization is certainly running high here. But it is also a place where there is breathing space for opposition views. I live in a small town called Franklin, which is very conservative, but we saw a No Kings protest there. Here you saw big No Kings protest in Nashville. So the First Amendment is still alive in Tennessee.
Quick final question for you, Madeleine Schwartz. Here in France, is there a Trump effect where politics, next year we have a presidential election, is going to become more heated, do you feel? Or is it, or does that turn voters away if you're too virulent?
Well, we're just coming off of a pretty long inquiry into public media here in France. I think that media is a subject that everyone likes to have an opinion on, but the reality is that if it goes away, people will really miss it. So we'll see what happens.
Madeleine Schwartz, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Bruce Kane as well. Nico Hines in New York City. Jacob Machangama in Nashville. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.